Mr. Speaker, it is great to see you back in person. It has been far too long and so much has changed. For one, you are the proud owner of another $10,000 of debt. Yet that is the per capita share of every man, woman, and child in Canada. $380 billion deficit this year for 38 million Canadians equals $10,000 per Canadian, or $40,000 for a family of four. Now, I don't know about you, Mr. Speaker, but I haven't met a lot of people who will tell me that their family has received $40,000 in COVID relief benefits. In fact, even if you received the CERB for a full 16 weeks, that works out to $8,000. And the majority of Canadians did not even receive that CERB. Although their mortgage is $40,000 bigger, they do not have $40,000 worth of benefits to show for it. So often that is the case with trickle-down government. The hardworking taxpayer has to climb the bureaucratic mountain with a big bucket of water on his back, and that water is then poured into the federal bureaucracy. It is sloshed around down to provincial bureaucracies and municipal bureaucracies, and then given on to other delivery bodies. And just as he gets back to the bottom of that bureaucratic mountain, there's a few drops that trickle down back into that bucket that he so laboriously took to the top of the hill in the first place. Now, the government will tell that taxpayer and all Canadians that we are in a crisis, thus justifying a deficit of this magnitude. And it is true. We do have a crisis. Now, we will put aside for a moment the fact that the government made the crisis worse by allowing tens of thousands of people from the most infected regions of the world to come into the country after military intelligence warned them of the danger. We will ignore the fact that many of the programs they designed since that time punished businesses for reopening and punished workers for working. We will ignore all of those failings and grant that indeed this is a crisis. But it's not our first crisis. Indeed, we fought world wars, we've had the Great Depression, the Great Recession. So how does this deficit compare to those deficits? It wouldn't be fair just to point out that our $380 billion deficit is 7 times the previous all-time record, because that doesn't adjust for GDP and inflation. So to be fair, let's compare the deficit as a share of GDP in inflation-adjusted terms. This year, the federal deficit is 17% of GDP. To compare, in the worst year of World War I, it was 8% of GDP. In the worst year of the Great Depression, it was 6% of GDP. In the worst year of the Great Global Recession, it was 4% of GDP. To put it in perspective, our deficit today is twice what it was in World War I, 3 times what it was in the Great Depression, and 4 times what it was in the Great Global Recession, all adjusted for the economy and inflation. Only once in our history has the deficit been bigger as a share of our economy, and that was in 1943. 1943, when the government was selling bonds to its people so that it could fight Hitler and Mussolini and Imperial Japan. They put those dollars to work to win the war, and yes, they had a deficit of 23% of GDP in that year. But you know what was different? When our soldiers came back from battle, you might have expected that, exhausted and heartbroken from loss, that they would want to take a prolonged vacation and put it on the national credit card and let future generations pay the bill. But they did exactly the opposite. You know how long it took our grandparents to balance the budget after they got back from the war? 1 year. 1 year. And within 2 years, they were running the largest budget surplus in Canadian history, 5% of GDP, the equivalent of $120 billion in today's relative terms. They fought for our freedom, and then they fought for our finances. Imagine if we had a government today with even a modicum of the integrity and respect and honor that our grandparents had those many years ago. Wouldn't we be in much better shape? But here we are today with a Prime Minister that not only effortlessly and carelessly spends our money, he tells us that money is not even a real thing anymore. Yesterday, in his bizarre address to the nation, he told us that spending more actually costs less. I'm not joking. You can look it up. That's what he actually said. Spending more money costs less. You know, it's clearly things now mean the opposite of what they say. This is not 1947. This is 1984. And we have a government engaged in doublespeak about the meaning of money. Now, they tell us that we can afford all of this debt because interest rates are low. And they're right, interest rates are incredibly low, stoked by the fact that central banks are producing an unprecedented amount of fake money through keystrokes at their bureaus. But those rates are not going to be low forever. Unless you believe that the debt will be paid off before the rates rise, then you have to believe that we've got trouble down the road. This government is not planning to pay back the debt ever. In fact, its own projections suggest that the debt will grow every year forever. And so, are they really expecting us to believe that never in the future will we return to normal levels of interest rates? Let me put it into perspective. This year, the effective interest rate across all of our debt will be somewhere in the neighborhood of 2%. That's not the bond yield today, but it's the average across the entire stock of federal debt, about 2%. The average over the last 2 decades is 5%. Do you know what the difference is between 5% and 2%? Someone said 3. They'll almost be right. 5% is more than double 2%. It is an increase of over 100%. In fact, Mr. Speaker, it is a massive increase and a massive change in our budget picture. When you more than double the interest rate applying to over $1 trillion of debt, you massively increase the amount of money diverted from social programs into the hands of wealthy and greedy bondholders, those people who lend us their money. They're not in charity, Mr. Speaker, they're in it for profit. So let's calculate what every point of increase would cost. It's very simple. At $1 trillion debt, it's about $10 billion in new annual costs for the taxpayer every time interest rates go up by just 1 percentage point. So if they went up 3 percentage points to the normal average over the course of the medium term, 4 or 5 years, we would be paying an extra $30 billion a year to service our debt. $30 billion a year is almost what we collect in GST revenues. Imagine this government in their back pocket keeping open the prospect of doubling the GST in order to pay for the cost associated with interest rates returning merely to their normal average levels. That is the risk that they are taking with our future. So what could we do differently? The answer is this. The answer is jobs, jobs, jobs. The only way to tackle this massive debt beast that our current government is creating is by returning our mighty workers to their jobs. Right now, we have 1 million missing jobs relative to the number of people who were working in February before COVID began. We now have the highest unemployment rate in the G7. Our unemployment rate at over 10% is 3 percentage points higher than the OECD average. We need a plan to unleash the free market system to hire people back, get out of the way, and let our mines, plants, and factories come roaring back to life? Why don't we let our steel workers and trades workers build pipelines that will create jobs in the energy sector in the West and the refining sector in the East? Get out of the way of small businesses by cutting red tape and lowering taxes on those entrepreneurs so they bring our main streets buzzing back to life. It is only through a bigger and broader economy that we can pay the prodigious costs associated with this government to continue to put food on the table and provide for our vital social safety net. That is the plan. That is what we must do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.